When the rain begins to fall in Kentucky, the ground does not drink, it stirs, as though something beneath has been waiting to breathe again. They buried the Morgraves a century ago, but each storm still sounds like the earth trying to give them back. When the rain comes down over the hills of Kentucky, it does not fall softly. It strikes the clay in sheets, turning roads to rivers and hollows to graves. In the spring of 1865, as the war's final smoke drifted north and the bodies of boys were laid in shallow ground, the soil itself seemed weary of taking more. The land had drunk too much of the dead, and some said it had begun to spit them back. That was the year the Morgrave family came to settle on the edge of Rowan County, where the earth was red and heavy, where rain sank slow and never truly left. Their homestead was modest, a single cabin and a low barn, built from timber stripped bare by the war. To the east stretched a narrow ridge, and beyond it a knuckled patch of higher ground where Elias Morgrave, the patriarch, had marked 6 plots for family burials. It was not uncommon for settlers to keep their dead close then. But the neighbors found it strange how quickly he fenced the place in, how deliberately he measured the space as though he were preparing not for life, but for what followed it. Local records survive in fragments: a county deed, a preacher's note, a physician's brief mention of that undertaker turned farmer from Virginia. The documents agree on one thing: the Morgrave plot was never still. Each time the rain fell hard enough to flood the valley, the ground above their graves swelled and broke. Coffins rose like driftwood. Earth split open as if exhaling, and when the water drained away, the pits remained gaping, glistening, half-closed, as though something within had tried to climb free. At first, the townspeople blamed the rain, the loosened soil, the undertaker's poor choice of ground, but after the second and third storm, that excuse thinned. Old men began to recall older stories, tales of land that had seen too much death, of soil soured by war. Women whispered that Elias Morgrave's profession had followed him home, that he had brought back more than tools from the dead he buried during the war. The documentary lens turned slowly over these accounts, a ledger page filmed in close-up, the words *graves disturbed after rainfall* underlined twice in trembling ink. A voice speaks low, measured, carrying the weight of disbelief softened by time. When even the earth rejects its dead, it says, what does it remember? The camera lingers on a photograph of the ridge, blurred by rain. The trees are skeletal, the grass thin. Beneath it, somewhere unseen, lie the Morgraves, or what was left of them, waiting for the next storm. For in this place, death did not end with burial. It began with rain. The Morgrave homestead stood low and lonely, pressed between the bend of the Licking River and the shadow of the ridge. The land there was neither dry nor steady. In every season, the ground seemed to sweat a slow, seeping damp that clung to boots and warped the timber of the porch. To most, it was undesirable land, too close to the floodplain, too soft for planting. But to Elias Morgrave, it was perfect. He claimed the earth there breathed easier, a phrase that would come to haunt those who remembered him. Elias was not born a farmer. Before the war, he had been an undertaker in Virginia, a quiet, methodical man with long fingers and a voice that never rose above a murmur. He had prepared soldiers and strangers alike for burial, working under lantern light while the war carved its toll into the country. When the fighting ended, he moved his family westward, saying he wanted distance from death. But he brought the craft with him, tools, chemicals, and habits that neighbors later said never left his hands. Anne Morgrave was of a gentler sort, though she seldom spoke beyond the family's fence. The children, 4 in all, were known in the township only by glimpses. The eldest girl, Margaret, was seen fetching water with a solemnity uncommon in youth. The boys, twins, worked the field in silence. The youngest, Sarah, clung always to her mother's skirts, her pale hair often wet from the mist that rolled in from the river. Those who passed the property said the family moved like shadows cast from one another, present, but never entirely distinct. The Morgraves kept to themselves, which in post-war Kentucky might have been forgiven, but what unsettled their neighbors was not their silence, it was their comfort with the presence of the dead. Elias built their small family plot on a rise behind the house before he had reason to use it. He tended it as if it were a garden, trimming the grass, straightening stones, pacing its border under moonlight. Some swore they heard him speaking there, low and deliberate, as though reciting a prayer too private for any church. When the preacher came to bless the homestead, he refused to step past the fence. The ground was too wet, he said, the air too still. He told Elias he ought to have chosen higher ground, but Elias only smiled, replying that the earth here knew how to keep what it was given. It was not the words themselves that disturbed the preacher, but the way Elias said them fondly, as though he were speaking of something alive. By the winter of 1865, the Morgrave homestead was a place of murmurs. Travelers spoke of strange reflections in the flooded fields, shapes that moved against the current. Neighbors whispered that the Morgraves prayed not for harvest, but for remembrance. And though nothing yet had happened to warrant fear, there lingered the uneasy sense that something beneath their land was listening. The Morgrave cemetery sat just beyond the ridge, a small sloping piece of land that overlooked the valley and the steady coil of the Licking River. It was not a grand place, no more than a patch of cleared earth marked by rough-hewn stones and a low fence of split rails. Yet Elias tended to it with a reverence that bordered on obsession. He cleared the brush himself, dug each grave by hand, and lined them in neat symmetry long before any member of his family had need for one. When a neighbor asked why he had gone to the trouble, Elias answered with his usual calm, "I do not trust strangers with the dead." In 1862, Kentucky, death was no stranger to anyone. The war had left every family touched by loss, and the churchyards were crowded with crosses leaning from soft soil. Still, there was something in Elias's insistence that made people uneasy. He spoke of the ground as though it could hear, as though it must be courted and convinced to keep what it was given. The preacher of the nearest parish offered to consecrate the plot, but Elias declined. "The earth knows its work," he said simply, turning away before the man could argue. The Morgrave cemetery became a curiosity among those who lived nearby. Children whispered of it when passing on errands, craning their necks to glimpse the fence line. Even from a distance, the land seemed perpetually darker than the rest, the grass thinner, the soil glistening as though dew never fully dried. During the first burial, a neighbor's stillborn child, whom Elias had volunteered to lay to rest the men who came to help dig, remarked how the soil filled with water faster than they could clear it. By the time the coffin was lowered, it floated briefly before sinking, swallowed by the mud. Elias said nothing, only knelt beside the grave and pressed his hand to the ground until the water stilled. From then on, every grave dug in that plot behaved the same way. Water seeped up through the clay no matter the season, pooling like tears before the coffins disappeared beneath. Some said the ridge lay over an underground spring, though no such spring had ever been mapped. Others whispered the soil was cursed, that it had grown weary of death after the war's slaughter, and now bled its protest through the rain. When storms rolled through the valley, lightning often struck close to that hill, and those who dared climb it afterward swore they could smell iron in the air, not rot, not decay, but something alive. Anne Morgrave would sometimes be seen there after sunset, her skirts damp with mud, kneeling by the stones as though in conversation. Her lantern's light flickered across the waterlogged ground, glinting off puddles that reflected no stars. From the valley below, it looked as if the graves themselves were breathing. And when dawn came, the hill gleamed with a dampness that refused to dry, as though the earth had spent the night weeping quietly for those it could not hold. The summer of 1866 arrived heavy and airless, a season that pressed upon the valley like a hand. The Licking River had already claimed 2 cattle and a mule that year, and fever ran through the hollows with the same slow persistence as the rain. In the Morgrave house, it came for the youngest first. Sarah was a pale, quiet child, her hair as colorless as straw, and her laughter so soft that it always seemed to echo after she'd stopped. One morning she failed to rise from bed, her skin glazed with a sheen that made her look more wax than flesh. By dusk her breath had grown shallow, her eyes turned glassy, and before the next dawn she was still. The fever had taken her quickly, but not quietly. Those who lived close said the family's cries carried down the river that night, broken and strange, as if they were mourning something larger than one small girl. It rained as if the sky meant to drown the ridge. The Morgraves' lanterns flickered against the torrent, shadows bending and breaking in the downpour. Elias refused to wait for clear weather or for the preacher. He dug the grave himself under the storm's eye. Each shovelful of earth filled again before it was cleared, the pit drinking rain as fast as he could cast it out. Anne stood under a blanket, cradling the small bundle that had been their daughter, her face blank with disbelief. Lightning cracked against the tree line, illuminating the fence posts and the 6 waiting plots. By dawn, when the thunder had rolled itself into silence, Elias lowered the coffin and pressed the soil down with his own hands. He spoke no prayer, only one line whispered to the ground: "Keep her." For 3 days the valley held its breath. The rain stopped, but the sky stayed swollen and gray. On the morning of the 3rd day, Margaret was the first to see it. The grave had sunk upon itself, the soil caved inward as though something below had stirred. When Elias went to mend it, he found the wood of the coffin splintered and the lid half risen, not from the weight above, but from pressure beneath. The child's body was still inside, unmarked, but the sight of it half emerged from the earth was enough to unmake the calm in him. He said nothing. He only set to work again, reburied her deeper, tamped the ground flat, and built a wooden cross above it with his shaking hands. Word traveled before the day was done. The Morgrave place had always been the subject of quiet talk, but now the whispers sharpened into fear. Neighbors said the ground had rejected the child, that the rain had woken something in the hill that did not want her there. Others swore they saw Elias under lantern light that night, standing motionless by the grave long after the wind had stilled, his hat in his hands, his face turned upward to the clouds. The next morning, a neighbor found footprints circling the plot, small, bare, and too light to belong to him. After that, the valley no longer spoke of fever. It spoke only of the earth that had spat out its dead. After Sarah's second burial, Elias Morgrave changed. The neighbors said he moved slower but watched more. His hands, once calloused from carpentry and fieldwork, returned to their old precision, the undertaker's touch. He began writing again, though not in the ledgers of his trade. Anne found him most nights hunched over a small desk beside the hearth, his pen scratching long into the hours when others slept. The first pages were orderly, measured, the handwriting neat and confident. He noted rainfall, barometric pressure, soil composition, the weight of moisture in the air. He wrote as though the answers could be wrestled from arithmetic. But as autumn deepened, the entries grew strange. He began to mention soft movement beneath the graves, and settling noises that do not correspond to wind or water. He logged the times precisely 2:14:37:3. 53 and recorded the length of each sound in seconds, as if the ground were breathing on schedule. One passage, written in a hurried scrawl, reads, asterisk, "Something shifts below the second plot. Not the settling of earth slower, almost deliberate, as though the weight is restless." Asterisk. Anne begged him to stop. She said the writing only made him worse, that every page looked more like prayer than record. But Elias could not stop. He kept his tools close now, chisels, small saws, the long-handled probe he once used to find soft ground before burial. On some nights he took the lantern and disappeared up the hill, returning hours later soaked to the waist, his boots thick with mud. When Anne asked what he had been doing, he only said, "Measuring." By December, the tone of his notes shifted again. The scientist gave way to the believer, or perhaps to the frightened man who had seen too much. His handwriting broke apart, words sprawling into the margins. He spoke of tremors without cause, of a pulse in the ground, faint but living. One entry, half erased by moisture, simply reads, Asterisk. She is not gone. None of them are gone. Asterisk. In the final pages, his language unraveled entirely. He stopped marking dates, stopped caring for order. The notes became confessions. I have heard them, one line reads. The rain brings them closer. Another, written in shaking ink. It is not the water that moves, but what waits inside it. The last line. Legible but fading as though the pen itself had faltered mid-stroke, carries no date at all. Asterisk. If the land will not keep them, then it is not land at all. Asterisk. When the winter storms came, the neighbors noticed the Morgrave lanterns burning through the night again. Some said Elias was digging, others said listening. The next thaw revealed new mounds on the hill, shallow, uneven, as if he had opened the earth and thought better of it halfway through. Whatever he sought in the soil, he never found peace in it. From that season forward, the valley stopped calling him a farmer. They called him what he had always been, the undertaker who could not let the dead stay buried. The spring of 1867 began with rain that seemed never to end. For weeks, the sky hung low and swollen, the kind of gray that presses upon a valley until it forgets what sunlight feels like. The Licking River, sluggish and brown, climbed its banks day by day, turning fields into mirrors of the clouds above. The Morgrave land lay nearest the bend, where the ground sloped gently into marsh. It had always been wet, but that year it drowned. Neighbors on higher ground spoke of seeing the Morgrave house like an island in a brown sea, smoke from its chimney curling through the mist, as if nothing were amiss. Yet inside, the walls shuddered with the weight of the water pressing at their foundation. Elias worked feverishly to protect the family plot. He waded through knee-deep mud with planks on his shoulders, building a crude wall of timber and stone around the graves. The rain washed over him in sheets, plastering his hair to his face. Anne begged him to stop. You can't keep it out, she cried from the doorway. But he only looked back, eyes hollow, and said, It isn't them I'm keeping out. It's what they stir when the water comes. When the floods peaked, the ridge disappeared. The Morgrave cemetery became part of the river, an eddying patch of current that twisted with debris and dead leaves. For 3 days, the valley drowned. And when the water finally began to draw back, the world it left behind was changed. The fence around the plot had collapsed. The ground was scoured clean of grass, a slick expanse of clay and roots. The graves were open, every one of them. Coffins had risen to the surface like driftwood, their lids splintered or missing altogether, their contents half swallowed by silt. Neighbors who came to help repair the damage fell silent when they saw it. All up the valley, churchyards and family plots stood untouched, the soil firm and unbroken. Only the Morgrave graves had moved. Men crossed themselves and refused to step closer. Elias did not thank them for coming. He only rolled up his sleeves and began the grim work of setting things right. He hauled each coffin back into the earth, his boots sinking ankle-deep, his breath ragged in the damp air. It is the water's will, not theirs, he said to no one in particular, repeating the phrase until it lost meaning. When the work was done, he rebuilt the wall himself, stone by stone, until his hands bled. By summer, the fence stood again, though crooked and warped by the flood's memory. The family no longer attended church, the preacher stopped calling, and travelers passing through the valley began to take the long way around, unwilling to ride past the hill that could not hold its dead. The rain returned often that year, but the Morgraves had learned not to speak of it. They lived with the sound of water beneath their feet, the quiet lapping of something that never dried, and each storm carried the same whisper through the valley, soft, steady, and certain that the earth below had begun to breathe again. Anne Morgrave's mother arrived from Tennessee in the late summer of 1867, a thin woman with trembling hands and eyes that watched the sky as though expecting a message. She had been unwell for months, and Anne begged her to stay through the harvest, to rest in the quiet of the valley. The older woman did, though neighbors later said she seemed uneasy from the first moment she stepped onto Morgrave ground. She complained that the air was too heavy, that the soil smelled of something left undone. When she spoke, her voice wavered as if each word resisted leaving her throat. Her illness worsened with the heat. Each morning she woke weaker, and each night she asked to be moved farther from the window, away from the sound of rain that still haunted the roof even on clear days. One evening, after a storm that came sudden and violent, Anne found her mother still and pale, her lips slightly parted as though she'd been whispering when death came. Elias prepared the body himself. He refused to summon the undertaker from town, saying, "I know how to send her properly." His wife did not argue, but she wept as he worked, the smell of oil and pine thick in the house. When word spread that another burial would be held on the Morgrave hill, the preacher arrived at the doorstep but would not cross the threshold. He looked toward the ridge, the fence, the soil still dark from the last flood, and shook his head. "That ground," he said, "is not natural." Anne pleaded, her voice raw, but the preacher backed away, muttering a prayer under his breath. Without him, Elias led the service himself, speaking in a low tone that the wind swallowed before it reached the mourners. Only 2 neighbors stayed long enough to see the coffin lowered. The rest drifted away before the last clod of soil was pressed down. That night, thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting open. The rain came hard and sudden, drumming on the roof until it felt as if the river had risen to meet the eaves. Anne woke in the early hours to a sound she would later describe as breathing through the ground. She woke Elias, but he dismissed it as the storm. By morning, the air hung still and gray, the kind of silence that follows exhaustion. When Anne climbed the hill, her heart seized. The new grave had shifted, one edge lifted. The soil buckled, as though the earth beneath had turned in its sleep. The coffin had surfaced halfway, its lid warped and soaked through, the wood splitting where nails once held it shut. Elias stood beside it, his hands trembling, rain dripping from his hair. Anne called his name, but he did not move. When she saw her mother's face, pale and unspoiled despite the storm, she screamed once and fell to the ground. By the time neighbors arrived, the grave was open to the light, the coffin glistening like a wound. Elias said nothing. He only closed the lid again and began to dig deeper, his boots sinking into the sodden clay, his expression blank. Those who watched from the edge of the field swore the ground quivered under each strike of the spade, as if something below was waiting, patient and restless, to rise again when the rain returned. By the autumn of 1867, the Morgrave land had fallen under a silence that was not peace, but waiting. The rains had eased, though the soil never seemed to dry. It glistened faintly even on the brightest days, dark and heavy, as if it held more than water beneath it. Neighbors who once passed by on the road began to take detours through the woods, unwilling to walk near the ridge. Those who did said they heard things there, low murmurs that carried through the air, indistinct but insistent, like voices trying to speak through water. The first to mention it aloud was a young farmhand named Harlan Pike, who worked a parcel adjacent to the Morgrave fields. He swore that after every heavy rain, when the clouds broke and the sun came back pale and thin, he could hear whispering from the direction of the cemetery. It wasn't the wind, he insisted. The wind shifts, comes and goes. This sound stayed steady, rising and falling in cadence, as if in conversation. Others laughed until they heard it too. Some said it came from beneath the ground, not above it. That was when the hands began to quit. One by one they left Elias to his fields, muttering that no man could plant near soil that spoke. Anne tried to ignore it. She told herself the sound was river water trapped beneath the hill, or wind funneling through the gaps in the fence. But there were nights when she woke to the faintest murmur through the floorboards, soft, rhythmic, like words she almost understood. On those nights, Elias would already be gone, the lantern missing from its hook. She'd see him returning just before dawn, boots caked in mud, his expression vacant, and unreadable. Fog began to rise from the cemetery even on clear days. It gathered low at first, just above the ground, then thickened until the gravestones vanished entirely. It did not spread or drift like natural mist. It stayed within the boundaries of the fence, as if the air itself obeyed the limits of the plot. Travelers passing on horseback said it smelled faintly metallic, like rain on iron, and left their animals uneasy. When a county surveyor was sent to assess the land for taxation, he spent a single afternoon near the ridge. His assistant later testified that the man's compass spun wildly whenever he approached the graves, the needle circling in endless confusion. The surveyor returned pale and shaken, his report incomplete. He refused to go back, claiming the instruments lost their sense on that hill. By winter, the Morgrave property had become a border of its own, a place the living skirted, where the air hummed faintly after storms, and the ground whispered its secrets to no one who wished to hear. The valley had seen its share of strange things, but none so constant, none so quiet. It was as if the earth itself had learned to speak, and what it said was not meant for the ears of the living. By midsummer of 1867, the church bell in Rowan County tolled not for service but for judgment. The preacher, Reverend Caleb Holt, had spent weeks weighing his conscience against the whispers that filled the pews. Each Sunday, the congregation grew thinner. Families once friendly with the Morgraves began to avoid their pew altogether, choosing to stand outside beneath the elm rather than sit where Anne had once knelt. The talk was no longer just of strange floods or whispering soil. It had turned darker into rumor of blasphemy. It began with the church's gravedigger, a gaunt man named Weller, who claimed Elias Morgrave had stolen something from the churchyard during the war. A bottle, he said, or perhaps a vial, something filled with a clear, viscous fluid that Elias had used in his embalming work. He said it could stop the body from turning, Weller told the preacher. Said he'd seen it keep the dead as clean as sleep. Reverend Holt dismissed it as idle gossip until more voices joined in. A widow from the valley claimed Elias had once asked to buy the blood of her recently deceased husband for study. Another swore she had seen jars of hair and bone soaking in liquids that smoked faintly even in cold air. The preacher finally rode to the Morgrave homestead to confront him. Elias met him at the gate, sleeves rolled, hands stained with the dark soil that never seemed to leave him. When Holt demanded an explanation for the rumors, Elias did not deny them. He said the church had forgotten the care of the dead, that embalming was sacred work, a way to keep the body whole for its passage. Decay is not God's will, he said quietly. It is only the failure of those who bury too soon. The reverend returned shaken, his faith tested not by argument, but by the conviction in Elias's voice. Within days, he called a meeting of the deacons. The church voted unanimously. The Morgraves were unfit for burial in Christian ground. Their family plot, consecrated by no hand but Elias's own, would henceforth be declared profane. When the notice was read aloud the next Sunday, Anne Morgrave did not attend. From their ridge, the family could hear the bell tolling and the distant murmur of hymns carried by the wind. Elias sat at his desk that night, turning the old war ledgers over in his hands. Within them were formulas scribbled in the margins, mixtures of arsenic, mercury, and something else unnamed. The ink was brown with age, but the instructions were precise. The same ingredients that preserved flesh were known to poison soil. By the end of that summer, the valley's crops withered along the Morgrave fence line. Nothing grew in that strip of ground, not even weeds. The air there smelled faintly of metal and oil, and on damp nights it shimmered as though holding heat of its own. The church said it was proof enough the land itself bore witness to the family's sin. Others whispered that it was not sin that tainted the ground, but knowledge Elias should never have possessed. Whatever the truth, no one came near the Morgrave hill again without crossing themselves first. The earth had turned against its keeper, and the church had turned against his name. Margaret Morgrave began her diary in the spring of 1868, when the house had already grown quiet with the kind of silence that feels like listening. She was 17, the eldest of the 4 children, though the valley still called her the undertaker's girl. She wrote in a small leather book her mother had given her before the war ended, filling it first with sketches of the river, bits of weather, and the birds she saw in the hedgerows. But as that summer deepened and the storms grew stranger, her writing changed. The pages turned inward, each entry shorter, tighter, as if she were afraid the words might be overheard. The first mention came in June, asterisk. The rain wakes them, asterisk, she wrote, without explanation. The next few pages described her walking the ridge after a storm, seeing puddles ripple though no wind stirred, and the feeling the certainty that something was moving below the water's skin. Not fish, she noted in careful hand. Not frogs, fingers. The words looked as though she had pressed too hard with the pen, the ink seeping through to the next page. She drew no faces, but the later entries spoke of shapes beneath the mud, and of how the earth seemed to breathe when rain fell. You can hear it if you stand still long enough, she wrote. The ground sighs, and the puddles whisper. By July, her diary had become a record of confession rather than observation. She spoke of waking to the sound of soft knocks, not at the door, but from beneath the floor. She claimed that when she peered into the rain barrels, she saw eyes staring back, clouded, unblinking, yet alive. They are not angry, she wrote one night. They are waiting. The water carries their voices. I know them by name. The next line was smudged, as though tears or rain had fallen across the page. Asterisk Sarah first, then grandmother. Asterisk. Anne found the book once, resting open on the table, and forbade her daughter from writing such things again. She told Margaret it was grief, that her mind had been turned by loss and the stories the townsfolk spread. Margaret obeyed for a week. Then the entries resumed, the handwriting more hurried now, as though written in the dark. She described standing at the window during storms and seeing the soil along the fence rise and sink, like a chest drawing breath. In one of her final entries, she wrote, asterisk, Father listens when it rains, he goes to them, I hear him answer back. Asterisk. The diary ends in August of that year. The last line stands alone on a near blank page, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. Asterisk. If we are meant to sink, why does the ground rise? Asterisk. Below it, a smear of mud obscures what might have been another sentence, or perhaps only a mark from her hand. Margaret was never seen after that week. Some said she'd gone north to relatives. Others whispered she'd followed the sound of rain into the earth itself. But her diary remained in the house, its pages damp and curling, as though the ground had already begun to reclaim it. Autumn came late to the valley that year, carried in by clouds so thick they blotted out the sun for days at a time. The rain did not fall in drops but in sheets, pounding the hillsides until the ridges themselves seemed to bleed. The Morgrave land, already soft and swollen from years of flooding, could no longer bear the weight. In October of 1868, after a storm that tore fences from their posts and swept livestock downriver, the hillside above the family plot gave way. The sound carried for miles a groan deep as thunder, followed by a crash that sent birds shrieking into the dark. When the clouds broke the next morning, the hill had split open, and the graves that had held so stubbornly to their secrets were laid bare. Neighbors arrived first, curious, then fearful. The cemetery fence was gone, carried off by the torrent. Where 6 graves had stood, the earth yawned wide and jagged, coffins jutting from the mud like broken ribs. The stench hit before they reached the ridge, a heavy, clinging sweetness that turned the stomach. But what lay inside those coffins silenced even the most hardened men. The bodies were untouched by decay. Skin pale and smooth, eyes half open as though caught between waking and death. Their clothing hung limp with rain, yet their faces remained whole, almost peaceful. Even the youngest child, Sarah, looked newly laid to rest. The undertaker's work had endured beyond reason. One man tried to close a coffin lid, but the wood would not catch. It warped against him, as if the air itself resisted sealing the dead away again. They left before nightfall, unwilling to linger. Some claimed the rain puddling in the graves shimmered faintly, as though light were trapped beneath its surface. Others swore the ground hummed underfoot. By the time they reached the valley road, all agreed on one thing: they would not return. That night, a glow rose from the Morgrave property. From a distance, it looked like lanterns, but when the wind shifted, the smell of burning pine reached the fields. Elias had set fire to his barn. The flames clawed into the sky, the orange reflection dancing on the river below. Neighbors watched from afar, unwilling to intervene. When the fire died, only the blackened skeleton of the barn remained. In the silence that followed, they saw a dim light flicker in the workshop behind the house, the place Elias had once kept his embalming tools and journals. No one saw him again after that night. When a few men finally climbed the ridge days later, they found the workshop door barred from within. They broke it open and found nothing but the smell of oil and damp earth. The floorboards were slick, the walls damp, and in one corner a puddle spread slowly outward from a single crack. It smelled not of rainwater, but of preservation fluid, metallic, bitter, and faintly sweet. The tools were gone, the journals too. Only the desk remained, its drawers open and empty. On the wall, scrawled in blackened ash, were the words, asterisk, "They will not stay," asterisk. From that day forward, the Morgrave farm stood abandoned. The locals stopped speaking Elias's name, though the memory of that hillside lingered. And when storms swept through the valley, the wind that followed carried with it the faint smell of smoke and decay, as though the land itself still burned for what it could not contain. The records that remain from the winter of 1868 are brittle and half-faded, but they tell enough to suggest the shape of what happened. Rowan County held a hearing that November, called hastily after word spread of the hillside collapse and the fire that followed. The courthouse was packed with townspeople who had not dared visit the Morgrave property, but who wanted to see the end of it made official. The clerk's handwriting in the transcript is neat, but nervous, as though his hand trembled. Asterisk case of public hazard Morgrave Homestead, Ridge Township. Asterisk it begins. Witnesses spoke of open graves, of the unrotted bodies that had frightened even the men who had fought in war. The preacher testified that the ground had turned against sanctity and could no longer be considered safe for Christian burial. A resolution passed in a single afternoon. The property was to be condemned and the graves reinterred in county soil. The entry ends abruptly, signed by 3 officials, each name trailing an inkblot. Newspapers followed the event with a feverish fascination. Asterisk Morgrave Homestead condemned, graves disturbed again. Asterisk read the headline in the Times Lexington Evening Clarion. Asterisk smaller papers from neighboring towns picked up the story, adding their own details, each stranger than the last. One claimed the bodies had been moved to the churchyard at Cedar Hill under supervision of the sheriff. Another insisted the coffins were found empty when the men arrived to collect them. By December, the reports contradicted one another completely. Some swore the corpses had been preserved like marble, while others wrote they had turned to ash when touched. In the courthouse ledger, a brief note was added weeks later. Asterisk inspection complete. Grounds abandoned. Asterisk. No signatures followed, and the addendum appears in different handwriting than the original order. It is the last official mention of the Morgraves in county records. Yet private letters from that winter tell a more fragmented story. A deputy named Hollis wrote to his brother that when they returned to the ridge to perform the reburial, there was nothing left to bury. The coffins, he said, were gone. The pits filled with clean water that reflected no image. He ended his letter with a line that was struck through but still visible beneath the ink. Asterisk. We heard something in the mud, like a breath turning over. Asterisk. From that point, the truth becomes vapor. Some claimed Elias returned that night to finish what the county would not, carrying his family's remains deeper into the woods where the land still flooded each spring. Others believed the hill itself swallowed them, reclaiming what the living had disturbed. Even the reporters who covered the story abandoned it quietly. Later editions make no mention of the family at all. The Morgrave farm vanished from maps within a year, listed simply as unusable land. The historian who later compiled the surviving clippings remarked that this was where the Morgrave story first lost its footing, in fact. The documents trail off into rumor, testimony thins into whispers, and the written word gives way to the unease that seeps through oral retelling. What truly happened on that ridge after the hearing, the reburial, the vanished coffins, the last night the earth lay open is no longer known. Only the silence of the record remains, and in that silence the legend began to breathe. By 1870, the Morgrave property had changed hands twice, though neither buyer stayed long enough to see a full harvest. The first, a veteran from Tennessee named Harlan Greer, arrived with his wife and 2 sons, drawn by the low price and the fertile appearance of the fields. From a distance, the land looked rich, dark, generous soil that promised yield even in lean years. But Greer would later write that from the first week, the ground sweated like flesh. It never hardened underfoot. His plow sank deeper with every pass until one day the blade vanished entirely, swallowed without sound. The new settlers rebuilt fences along the ridge, only to find them warped and rotted within weeks, the posts leaning inward as if drawn to something below. On clear days, the earth steamed faintly, a haze that smelled of iron and wet leaves. Neighbors said it was just the lowland damp, the natural breathing of floodplain earth. But Greer's livestock told another story. Cows grew restless before rain, lowing in the dark as though spooked by thunder not yet arrived. Twice that spring he found animals half buried in the pasture, their legs sunk knee-deep in soil that should have been solid. "It's like the ground takes them," his wife wrote in a letter to her sister. "You pull them free and the hole closes behind them, neat as a mouth." When the next buyer came, a surveyor from Louisville seeking quiet farmland, he lasted less than a season. His surviving journal kept by the county clerk after his death records tremors felt during rainfall, as though a slow hand passed under the field. He described the sensation not as shaking, but breathing. The soil rises beneath the feet and falls again, a pulse too deep to chart. His final entry ends with a single observation, asterisk. If this land once buried the dead, it remembers them still, asterisk. He disappeared that summer after a week of heavy storms. His horse was found tethered outside the house, his belongings undisturbed, the ground around the property pocked with shallow depressions filled with rainwater. Other settlers refused to touch the property after that. The county declared it cursed ground in everything but name, marking it on maps as flood hazard. Yet curiosity persisted. Letters exchanged among officials mentioned strange patterns in the floods that followed. The rain would fall for days elsewhere, but in the Morgrave Hollow, it came only in bursts, violent, sudden, and eerily precise, as though centered on the ridge. A letter preserved in the archives, unsigned but dated that same year, contains the most chilling line of all. Asterisk. The rain here does not fall, it returns. Asterisk. No one has lived there since without hearing it, the whispering patter that starts before the first drop, the tremor that moves through the ground like something turning in its sleep. Each generation called it by a new name, the Breathing Hill, the Morgrave floodplain, the Cursed Ridge. But all who stood there during a storm said the same thing. The earth moved as if remembering, and the rain never came from above. It rose. By the summer of 1883, nearly 15 years after the Morgrave homestead was condemned, curiosity had begun to outweigh fear. The younger generation, who had grown up hearing only fragments of the tale, dismissed it as superstition born from war and weather. Among them was a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, a self-taught historian from Lexington with a fascination for buried American myths. He arrived in Rowan County, claiming he would prove the Morgrave curse nothing more than hydrological coincidence. He brought with him 4 assistants, 2 hired laborers, and a photographer to document the excavation. Locals watched from a distance, muttering that the ridge did not take kindly to being disturbed again. The dig began on a hot August morning. Finch set his team to work at the base of the old hill where the Morgrave graves were said to have once lined the slope. The first shovelfuls turned easily, too easily, the men said, as though the soil were newly turned despite years of abandonment. Beneath a thin crust of weeds lay damp earth that smelled of brine rather than rot. They expected to find bones, fragments of coffins, perhaps rusted nails. Instead, what they uncovered sent one laborer running down the hill before noon. 6 warped coffins rested in the mud, some splintered open, their interiors hollow and slick. But it was what lay deeper that caught Finch's attention. Glass jars, each sealed with yellowed wax and buried in careful symmetry. There were dozens, some the size of a fist, others large enough to hold a man's skull. The men pried them loose one by one, wiping the mud from the glass to reveal what floated within. Inside each jar was a different arrangement. A lock of human hair suspended in clear fluid, smooth stones etched with inverted crosses, scraps of cloth folded neatly as though for burial. One jar held only murky water that shimmered faintly when brought into sunlight. Finch believed the jars to be remnants of Elias Morgrave's undertaker experiments, preservation rituals mistaken for witchcraft. He noted that the backward crosses might have been alignment markers or chemical symbols, but his explanation did little to settle the men. They carried the jars to town and placed them in the cellar of the courthouse, labeled for study. Within 3 days, every seal had split. The wax softened and peeled away, though the room was cool and dry. When the sheriff opened the cellar door on the 4th morning, he found the floor wet as though a storm had passed through. The jars lay cracked but clean, their contents gone except for clear water that left no residue, no scent, and no trace of what had once floated inside. Finch wrote in his final report that the evidence dissolved overnight. He left the county before autumn, refusing further interviews. Years later, when another historian sought his notes, they found the pages warped and faintly damp despite decades of storage. The locals said it plain. The hill had taken its things back, and when the next rain came, the creek below the ridge ran clear for the first time in years, but only for a day. By the next morning, it had turned the color of smoke. By the turn of the century, the Morgrave land was known by a new name, the Hollow Hill. Maps no longer marked it as farmland or floodplain, only as an empty ridge above the Licking River. But in the nearby towns, everyone knew what it meant. The name carried more than direction, it carried warning. Travelers passing through the county spoke of strange vibrations felt beneath their boots when thunder rolled in the distance. Wagon wheels would rattle though the road was smooth, and horses would snort and refuse to cross the stretch nearest the ridge. Those who lingered claimed they could hear a low hum in the earth, a tone that grew louder as storms approached. Children of the valley turned the place into a dare. They called it the breathing ground, saying if you pressed your ear to the soil before a rain, you could hear the hill inhale. It was not a whistle or rumble, they insisted, but the sound of lungs filling slow, deep, and wet. They told each other stories about the air that rose from cracks in the ground, heavy with the smell of iron and moss. On summer nights, they'd run up the slope with lanterns, daring one another to place their hands on the soil and feel it pulse. Some came back laughing, others pale and quiet, saying it moved like skin. Folklore hardened into ritual. Farmers who worked nearby would hammer iron nails into the corners of their fields to keep the damp from spreading. When drought struck and the creeks ran to dust, the hollow hill stayed slick with moisture. A green bruise in a land gone yellow. The grass never withered there. Mushrooms grew in rings even under direct Sunday. Old men at the general store said it was because the dead below are thirsty, and everyone chuckled, but no one drank from the wells closest to the ridge. Travelers who camped too near the hill often woke to find their tents damp despite clear skies. One diary, found decades later in a wagon trunk, records a night in 1899 when a peddler heard a faint gurgling beneath the ground. Like bubbles rising in a deep pond, he wrote. When the wind stilled, the sound continued. He left at first light and refused to travel that route again. By the early 1900s, the hill had become more myth than memory, yet the locals treated it with the same wary respect they gave to graveyards. Storms still gathered over it first, rain falling in sheets while the rest of the valley stayed dry. Those who witnessed it swore the drops seemed to rise from the earth instead of falling from the sky, a mist lifting upward to meet the clouds. The hollow hill was no longer simply a piece of land. It was a wound that would not close, a place where the breath of the buried had turned the ground itself into something alive. In 1932, when the country was caught between drought and despair, a folklorist named Robert Keene arrived in Rowan County with a notepad, a hand-cranked recorder, and a hunger for stories that clung to the land. He'd been collecting Appalachian tales for years, haints, witches, crossroads, miracles, but the locals told him there was one story he wouldn't write, the one about the hill that breathed. They called it the Morgrave place, though no one alive had met a Morgrave in decades. Keene persisted. He spent a week in the valley, sitting on porches with the oldest residents, coaxing fragments of memory into sentences. What he found unsettled even him, a man who'd made a career of ghost stories. He titled his final account Times, "The Family the Earth Refused." In it, he described a lineage of undertakers turned farmers, a house that sank by inches each spring, and a burial ground that spat its dead into daylight. The old women he interviewed remembered hearing their parents speak of the hill that hums, and one man, nearly 90, claimed to have seen the graves himself as a boy. They were people the ground could not hold, he said, his voice trembling on Keene's tin recording. Every time it rained, you could smell them. Keene wrote of how the soil stayed damp even in drought years and how locals salted their thresholds during storms to keep the rising out. When his article was published in a small regional journal, readers dismissed it as rural superstition, but his notes, pages thick with humidity stains, hinted at something he'd seen firsthand. In the margin of one entry, he scrawled, "Asterisk. The ground trembles even now. Asterisk." 4 decades later, when America's fascination with the paranormal was reaching new heights, a small film crew from Lexington sought to revisit Keene's work. They planned a short documentary for regional television, combining folklore with atmospheric visuals of old Kentucky ghost sites. The Hollow Hill was to be their final segment. The team, 3 men, 1 woman, spent 2 days filming interviews with locals who spoke warily of the breathing ground. They laughed at their own nerves, calling it a perfect ending for the show. On the 3rd day, they hiked to the ridge to capture B-roll. The weather was clear, the sky so bright it washed the horizon pale. The recovered notes from that shoot tell a different story. A surviving sound engineer later said the microphones picked up a low vibration just before they began rolling, like a heartbeat through the soil. The cameraman called it interference, yet the lens kept fogging, though the air was dry and still. Midway through the shoot, they heard what they described as a rush of wind without wind, a pressure that swelled and vanished. Then the camera jammed. When they returned to town and developed the film, every frame of the Hollow Hill sequence was destroyed. The emulsion had blistered and run, the image drowned in fluid streaks, though the canister had never been opened to rain. The studio labeled it Time's water damage asterisk, an impossibility on the cloudless day they filmed. The footage was never reshot. The project aired incomplete, with the final narration cut mid-sentence. Of the 4 crew members, only one sound engineer, Walter Grant, ever spoke of what happened. Years later, he told a reporter, "We didn't lose the film. It was taken. The water didn't come from the sky. It came from underneath." And then he stopped giving interviews. The documentary, like the hill itself, ended where the evidence dissolved into silence. In the present day, the Morgrave Ridge no longer appears on most maps. It sits behind overgrown fields, fenced off by barbed wire, and the caution signs of a county that has long since given up explaining it. The locals still know where it lies. They do not go there after sundown, not since the rains began to change again. For the last 20 years, every heavy storm has carried with it a strange aftermath. When the clouds break and the creeks spill over their banks, pieces of wood have been found scattered near the ridge, splintered, dark, and slick, as though freshly soaked from underground. Some match the shape and size of coffin planks, though no one admits that aloud. The farmers who find them leave them where they lie. A few have tried burning them, but the wood hisses and refuses to catch. Those who have dared photograph the ridge after the rain show the same unsettling pattern: indentations in the earth, shallow and unmistakably human-shaped. They appear overnight in clusters, filled not with mud, but with clear water that never clouds. The photos circulate quietly, texted between neighbors, posted briefly online before disappearing. One taken in 2009 shows the outline of what looks like a child's form, arms close to the body, the water within it rippling though the air was still. Another from 2017 captures three hollows side by side, each the length of a grown man, reflecting the sky like mirrors. Those who see the images say they look less like graves and more like impressions left by something rising, then sinking back again. The county has issued explanations before: sinkholes, erosion, runoff channels from old drainage veins. A geologist once drove out from Lexington to test the soil, reporting it as oversaturated peat, though he admitted the ground near the ridge pulsed faintly beneath his boots. His report was filed away, never followed up. The official line remains the same: shifting groundwater. But the people who live along the Licking River say otherwise. They hear the hum before storms, the same low resonance their grandparents once described. They say the rain at the ridge does not strike the earth like elsewhere. It seeps upward, meeting the falling drops halfway, as if the hill exhales to greet it. On quiet nights, when thunder hangs distant and the first drizzle begins, the air turns heavy and the ground grows restless. Dogs refuse to bark. The wind moves through the pines in long, even breaths. Neighbors who've lived there their whole lives will pause in their doorways and listen, knowing the sound by heart. It's just the rain, they'll tell their children, though their eyes drift toward the ridge. And when the sky opens at last, pouring over the hollow hill, the whisper carries through the valley once more, just loud enough to rise above the storm. Asterisk. When it rains, they breathe. Asterisk. The report began as a routine survey. In 2016, Dr. Marcus Ellery, a hydrologist from the University of Kentucky, was contracted to study subsurface water movement across the floodplain. The county hoped his findings might explain the persistent dampness around the Morgrave Ridge, a curiosity more than a concern. Ellery arrived in late spring, bringing a small team and a set of digital sensors meant to track groundwater flow and pressure differentials. On paper, it was a straightforward task: chart the movement of aquifers beneath an unremarkable patch of land. But by the end of the summer, his notes read more like a confession than a field report. The first irregularity appeared within days. Ellery's instruments detected voids below the ridge, pockets of vacuum rather than water, fluctuating in volume every few hours. Impossible under normal geological conditions, he wrote. The voids open and close without external cause, producing measurable drops in air pressure. Pattern suggests respiration. His assistants laughed it off at first, calling it machine error, but recalibrations produced the same results. The readings followed no weather patterns, no seismic events. The voids would expand, then contract, in slow cycles lasting between 7 and 10 minutes. When they stood over the ridge during those readings, the soil trembled faintly, and the sensors recorded a low-frequency vibration, a rhythmic pulse that traveled upward rather than down. In one entry, Ellery noted that the air around the ridge grew warmer each time the voids exhaled. The temperature rose by several degrees within seconds, accompanied by a faint smell of metal and rot. He began to take soil samples at different depths, expecting to find methane or decomposing organic matter. But the cores came up clean, no gas pockets, no decay. Instead, the moisture content increased dramatically at depths where no water table should exist. The Earth here holds more fluid than its volume allows, he wrote. It does not absorb, it circulates. The project faltered in its third week when one of the monitors malfunctioned, bursting its housing from internal pressure. The data log, recovered from the damaged unit, showed a sudden spike, a vacuum collapse so abrupt it registered as a negative wave. The following day, Ellery suspended fieldwork, claiming equipment instability. In private, his notes tell a different story. There was a sound beneath the hill, he wrote. Not seismic, rhythmic, like lungs drawing air through stone. He returned once more at dusk, alone, leaving his team at the hotel. The final pages of his notebook are water-stained, the handwriting jagged. The voids move with the rain, he wrote. When the ground drinks, they wake. These are not caverns. The land is not hollow. His last line is written in larger, darker script, the pen pressed so hard it cut into the paper. Asterisk. It is alive. Asterisk. The county never received his completed report. The university filed his disappearance as voluntary resignation. The equipment was recovered weeks later, buried in silt near the ridge, its metal casings warped inward, as if crushed by something breathing in. The rains returned heavier than before, not in the sudden torrents that battered the valley in spring, but in long, ceaseless curtains that blurred day and night into one damp procession. For those living within sight of the old Morgrave ridge, the storms brought a different kind of unease, one that started, always, with the wells. Within hours of the first downpour, the water in household pumps would rise unnaturally fast, sloshing just below the rim. It came up gray, like diluted ash, with a faint oily sheen that caught lamplight in strange colors. Those who dared to taste it said it carried the bite of chemicals, sharp and metallic, with an aftertaste reminiscent of rot and rust. To others it smelled unmistakably of the undertakers' work preservatives, formalin, embalming fluid. Families along the Licking River began hauling water from other counties, refusing to drink or wash with what the land offered. A few who ignored the warnings found their livestock dead by morning, their wells rimed with a pale film. Others claimed the water did more than poison. It moves, one farmer told a local radio host. You can see it shifting in the bucket, like it's breathing. The county inspectors came, took samples, and issued their findings: trace minerals, natural contamination, runoff from old septic lines. Nothing out of the ordinary, but those who'd lived there long enough to remember their grandparents' stories knew what the tests could not show. This wasn't runoff, it was return. By the third storm that year, the ground itself began to betray the pattern. On nights of heavy rain, when the air thickened and thunder rolled far off, neighbors reported seeing ripples spread across their yards, though the soil lay flat and dry. The movement passed outward from the direction of the ridge, slow and deliberate, like rain falling in reverse. The puddles don't grow, one woman said. They rise. Photographs taken in haste show faint concentric circles forming in the dirt, as though something beneath were pushing upward to meet the storm. The churches took notice. Pastors who had long avoided speaking the Morgrave name began to work it back into their sermons. The earth remembers what man tries to bury, one preacher warned from the pulpit, his voice breaking as the rain hammered the roof. In another county, a small congregation held night vigils during storms, praying not for safety but for rest, for the ground to finally accept what it had refused a century before. They called it the Watch Against the Rising. By midsummer, several families had abandoned their homes, leaving behind signs on their gates that read Times water unfit, asterisk. Those who remained sealed their wells and covered their drains with salt. Yet no barrier seemed to matter. Each rain carried the same smell, sweet, chemical, and ancient. The scent drifted through windows and clung to the air long after the clouds cleared, as if the ridge itself was exhaling. And when questioned about it, the old residents of the valley only repeated what their ancestors had whispered generations before. Asterisk. When the rain comes, the dead remember the way up. Asterisk. The story ends where it began, with rain. Not the furious downpour of flood years, not the storms that tear at roofs and rivers, but a soft, steady rhythm that soaks into the soil until it shines. It is the kind of rain that carries sound rather than silence, the kind that reminds a place of everything it has ever been asked to hold. On the ridge once called the Morgrave homestead, the pines still bend in that familiar direction, as though listening for something beneath them. The names are mostly gone now, the stones eroded smooth, the records eaten by mold and time. Yet each time the sky breaks, the land answers. The air thickens, the ground exhales. A family buried more than a century ago still lingers here, not in ghost stories told by firelight, but in the uneasy pulse of the soil, in the way puddles ripple when no wind moves. Historians have tried to classify it, scientists to measure it, the church to sanctify or condemn it. None have succeeded. The truth remains the same as it was when Elias Morgrave built his first coffin and swore he would not trust strangers with the dead. Whatever he buried, the earth refused. It rejected silence. The land does not haunt so much as remember. The rain carries its memory from season to season, tracing invisible lines through the valley where coffins once floated, where jars cracked open to spill their clear, impossible water. Locals say you can still hear a hum before a storm, a vibration that starts deep underground and rises like breath held too long. Some call it superstition, others call it proof. But for those who live within hearing distance, it feels like something older than both, a rhythm the living were never meant to disturb. Each generation has given the story a different name. Folklorists call it the curse of the floodplain. Scientists describe it as geological anomaly. The old families still whisper of the breathing ground. Yet, every telling ends the same way, with the reminder that the ridge never sleeps. The rains come, the wells darken, and the ground heaves gently, like a creature dreaming beneath its own skin. No bones have been found, no spirits rise to speak. There is only the movement, the sigh, the refusal. In the end, there is no proof of haunting, no proof of miracle, only a stubborn, silent pulse that outlasts memory. Perhaps it is grief, perhaps it is guilt, or perhaps the earth, in all its weight and patience, has simply learned to answer back. The final words fall softly, almost lost beneath the rain. Asterisk. If the earth rejects the dead, perhaps it remembers too well what we have done to it. Asterisk. Then nothing. Only the faint, steady rhythm of water against wood, against stone, against soil, like the sound of graves breathing open once more.